Number 6. Appeal to popularity fallacy. Another thing that they like to do is appeal to popularity. For example, they will oftentimes argue, gay right, etc., etc. The problem is these things, gay rights or, these modern values like feminism or gay rights, they didn't exist back in the 6th century. They are a modern innovation. See, the problem is that their moral values that they are using to judge Islam, their moral values itself is problematic because it's continuously changing. A few years ago, alcohol was, banned. It was considered bad. At least like in America, 100 years ago, I believe, alcohol was banned or something like that. Then all of a sudden, it was allowed. And now soon drugs will be allowed. And everyone is doing drugs. Does that mean that doing drugs is right? No. Just because it's popular or everyone is doing it doesn't mean that it's right. Therefore, just because someone is championing things like gay right or feminism doesn't mean that these things are actually objectively right. These are your subjective moral values that you've developed in the last 30-40 years. They didn't exist before then. 100 years ago, no one talked about gay right. Gays were hanged. So you cannot take these modern things that you developed recently and then apply them to Islam, because in Islam the morality is completely objective. It doesn't change. So you cannot take your subjective morality and compare that with an objective morality. It just doesn't make sense. And it's appeal to popularity fallacy, because just because it's popular doesn't mean it's true or right. The same way, drugs is not right because drugs could harm you. In a few hundred years, how do you know that things like feminism or veganism or whatever isms out there won't be considered bad again? Since you're changing your morality like a fashion trend, how do you know it's gonna stay the same? Your next generation could be judging you for things you consider completely normal, like using the internet or whatever, because you never know where your morality might go. So this is the problem with their morality or their sense of morality, is that it's not fixed and it cannot be taken seriously because it's based on this timeline. And if you're going to judge, then you have to be sure that what you have is solid. But unfortunately, most of the things that they champion and accuse Islam of, these things aren't objective. They're subjective moral values. So, yeah. Number 7. The fallacy of composition. Now, you'll oftentimes notice that Islamophobes oftentimes, or critics of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, oftentimes will commit this fallacy. Basically, what they'll do is that they'll take one example from his life and something that seems controversial or they disagree with, and they'll apply that to all of his life and say that this is how he always was, even though that was just one small example of his life. For example, we know that he was the head of his army. He had to fight to protect the people of Medina, and they will take this example and say that, well, he was always committing war and stuff like that. That's all he was. They will completely ignore all the good things that he did and only focus on that and say that, he always committed war and etc. etc. This is ridiculous because we know that that's not true. The Prophet did other things. He gave charity. He talked about Islam. He, helped non-Muslims, Muslims. He taught people how to be kind to one another. So taking one example from his life means nothing. You're just giving one example. And as we already discussed, the Prophet is not perfect. So taking one example that's not necessarily part of Islam and then say that he was always like that is again intellectually dishonest, and it's a fallacy of composition. A good example of this would be Prophet's marriage with Aisha. They will oftentimes say that, well, Aisha was very young, and it's true, she was young. However, just because she was young doesn't mean he always liked young girls. I mean, most of his wives were much older than Aisha, and Aisha radiallahu anhu was the only one who was young. As a matter of fact, his first wife, Khadija radiallahu anhu, she was a lot older than him. So, and I always kind of find it funny, because they have no problem with his marriage with Khadija radiallahu anhu, who was with like 20 to 30 years older than him, but they have a big issue with his marriage with Aisha radiallahu anhu. Probably because I don't know why that is. Maybe because it's a girl, or when it's a girl, it's easier to victimize them. I don't know, but regardless, this is the fallacy of composition, and this type of argument is kind of silly, because you're just taking only one example of something that he did. That that's not how he was always. I mean, he did different things. He didn't always go to war. He didn't always marry young girls. He was just one example. So taking one example and saying that that's how he always was is intellectual dishonesty.